Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Snyder. I'm the reference librarian at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and I'm so excited to be with you here today with a colleague of mine, Kayla Anthony, and we're going to be discussing Elizabeth Willing Powell and her husband, Samuel Powell, two of George Washington's very closest friends. And we figure with this being the year of the woman, why not talk about a super powerful woman that really helped shape the founding of the Republic. So I myself am a Powell scholar, and I have been working on the project that I've been doing for about 3 years. And I will have a chapter coming out in an edited volume that's going to be published by the University of Virginia Press in January 2022. So I very much look forward to sharing that with you all in the future. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to my colleague and dear friend, Kayla Anthony. And I will pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you to Mount Vernon for asking me to participate today. I'm excited to also share Elizabeth's story. I think you'll all enjoy it very much. I'm the executive director for the Philadelphia Society for the Preservation of Landmarks, and we are an 89-year-old nonprofit that stewards 4 historic house museums. The Powel House, where I am today. So I am in the ballroom at the Powel House. This is the home, the ancestral home of Samuel and Elizabeth Powell. We also have the Hill Physic House, which is just around the corner from here in Society Hill in Philadelphia. We have Brumblethorpe, which is in Germantown, and Historic Waynesboro, which is out in Paoli. And our mission is to not only preserve our 4 historic sites, but also to provide related cultural, educational, and historical programming. I thought it might be interesting to talk maybe a little bit about how we came about, because our organization, as I mentioned, is 89 years old. It'll be 90 next year. It's exciting. And we were founded in 1931 by a woman named Frances Ann Wister. So much like Mount Vernon, we were founded by a very strong matriarch, and the organization was born essentially to save the Powell House from demolition. It was slated to be knocked down for a taxi cab parking lot. And Frances Ann and her colleagues and friends rallied together and managed to raise about $30,000 at the height of the Great Depression to save not only the Powell House, but the house that was next door originally. And from there, advocacy turned into longtime stewardship, and we started to acquire more and more properties. So that's who we are, and we're excited for Sam's research. We feel like this is going to be really helpful in further interpreting Elizabeth's story in particular. So thank you again for having me here today.
Absolutely. So I think, Kayla, I want you to kind of introduce Samuel Powell, and then I'll go into a little information on Elizabeth Powell. So I know you want to talk about a really lovely portrait of Samuel that we have, or that you have. So I'll go ahead and let you explain good old Sam.
Perfect. So this is Samuel Powell. So this is the man whose house we interpret here in Philadelphia. Samuel was born actually in 1738 into a wealthy Philadelphia family. His grandfather was a carpenter and amassed quite a bit of wealth, which he inherited in his early 20s. He also, his biggest claim to fame, I suppose, was the fact that he was the last mayor of Philadelphia under the British Crown and the first mayor of Philadelphia in the New Republic. He also had his hand in a number of different organizations in Philadelphia. He was a member of the Library Company of Philadelphia, the American Philosophical Society, the Hand in Hand Fire Company, and the Society for Promoting Agriculture, which, if you're well familiar with Washington, you can imagine that was, of course, an interesting topic between the two of them, which Sam will talk about later. Samuel Powell also served as in the Pennsylvania State Senate, as well as the Speaker. And so he was a really well politically connected individual in Philadelphia. And I'll turn it back over to Sam to talk a little bit about Elizabeth.
Sure. So I'm happy to talk about Elizabeth. This is actually, I want to briefly mention this. This is a new portrait that we've recently acquired thanks to an anonymous donor of Elizabeth Willing Powell from circa 1793. So this was kind of at the height of her social scene, which Kayla will talk about more of how the Powells had just their home being the social epicenter. This was a portrait that we think was done by Joseph Wright, who actually died from the yellow fever epidemic, just like Samuel Powell did. So this portrait was never finished, but I think it really has an amazing kind of, it really shows her presence and who she was as a person. So let me tell you a little bit about who she was prior to knowing George Washington. So Elizabeth was born in 1742 in Philadelphia to two very wealthy families. So her father was a merchant and her mother was a member of the Shippen family. And some of you may recognize the name Shippen. If you've ever watched Turn, Peggy Shippen Arnold, she was actually Elizabeth's second cousin. So there's definitely a connection there. But she grew up very wealthy. She was likely educated by her mother, but she and her sisters had a lot of fun in Philadelphia during the French and Indian War. When soldiers were quartered in Philadelphia, they went to assemblies, they went fishing, and she and her sisters, two of them were actually called the Three Goddesses. So I like to think that they were very much the Schuyler sisters of Philadelphia just a few years earlier. So Elizabeth, of course, married Samuel on August 7th, 1769, and then they purchased a house on 3rd Street, which I know Kayla is going to tell us more about.
So that is where I am today, actually. So this house, this is the Powel House. It's on 422 South 3rd Street in Philadelphia. Please come visit us. We are open for tours currently, Thursday through Sundays, 11 to 3 p.m. with tours on the hour. We'd love to see you there. If you can get away, or if you're around the Philadelphia area, it's great to have tours still happening right now, given the current circumstances with COVID. But this is the Powell House. This is where Sam and Elizabeth moved into, and it was originally built in 1768 by Charles Stedman. He was also a merchant, and he unfortunately went bankrupt, and shortly thereafter, Samuel purchased the house. This place really became, though, the epicenter of social life in Philadelphia. The socially elite gathered here frequently, as well as political elite. So while it is an important place to not only host just family members and various friends of the Powels, it was also a place where they hosted a number of intellectual salons of the time period. So this was the room that I'm in, actually, the ballroom, is where we like to sort of imagine that it happened. There we go. So this is where Elizabeth would have been hosting her salons. And the Marquis de Chatelieu noted in his travel journal that she was one of the most European styled salons were the ones that Elizabeth was hosting here. And this was a way to engage in different civic conversations, intellectual conversations on different topics as far as novels and politics. And Elizabeth later in her life comments on how she hosted many of the Constitutional Convention delegates here. And that was a very all-frequented topic at her house. So it's interesting to think about how a woman in the 18th century could use what was afforded to her, such as a salon, in order to influence politics that were going on not only in Philadelphia, but nationally. So that's one of her kind of claims to fame here in Philadelphia, are these salons. And she's well sought after. And Sam, you can talk about this a little bit more if you'd like, but she's certainly, people are coming to Philadelphia to see her, and maybe more so her than even Samuel.
Yeah.
So one thing, like I mentioned, the Constitutional Convention delegates were coming to visit here for these salons. They were, of course, friends and business associates with the Powels, but maybe perhaps some of the most important ones that you've heard of course, were, and this is a number of all the founding fathers you would have heard of, but Benjamin Franklin was a guest here, John Adams, and Abigail Adams, the Marquis de Lafayette, the Marquis, again, de Chatelieu, of course, and our beloved George and Martha Washington, who did end up becoming very close friends with the Powels. And they actually lived, and we kind of believe that they probably they might have known each other earlier, but they probably started to develop a friendship around the 1780s when Washington lived next door to the Powell House. Sam, would you like to talk a little bit more about the Washingtons' relationship with the Powels?
Absolutely, Kayla. Thank you. So as Kayla said, they lived next door. The Washingtons lived next door to the Powells in 1781 to 1782. And this image is actually from 1800. It is a engraving of the 3rd Street, and it's done by an artist named William Birch. And the Powell House itself is just in the background. And the house that the Washingtons rented was right next door to that. And so they were there for just a few months, but during those few months, I think is really when they started to develop a close friendship. And Kayla's right, everyone was going through the Powell House at that point. And of course, if you're a Washington fan, you know who the Marquis de Châteauroux is. He's one of Washington's best friends. So I'm sure they often discussed the Powell's merits together. But yeah, so they, at that point, Washington is about finished with the war. So he's kind of going back into the social scene. He didn't often get to spend a lot of time in city centers. So he was a bit behind on the cultural trends. And I think that the Powells, at least during my research from what I've found, the Powells were very much at first kind of leading Washington and Martha into society. And during the 1780s, even after the Washingtons left Philadelphia, the two of them, Washington and Elizabeth, and then Washington and Samuel, really started to develop their friendship. Elizabeth and Washington would trade publications back and forth. So again, that highlights just how well-read she was and how educated she was. And so they actually, Washington sent her a copy of Visions of Columbus, and then one of Châteauroux's publications, and a whole host of others. And then, of course, Samuel and Washington had their agricultural connection, and Samuel sent Washington some seeds, and Washington actually notes that in his diaries that the seeds are growing well and they're from Mr. Powell in Philadelphia. So they very much had a fun friendship. It definitely was advantageous for both of them, but they did connect on a very personal level. So that's been definitely a fun thing to discover. But what I do want to talk about is when the Washingtons came to Mount Vernon. So when the Powells came to Mount Vernon to see the Washingtons. So just after the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the Washingtons went back to Mount Vernon, and the Powells made a decision to go visit Elizabeth's sister, Mary Willingbird, down at Westover Plantation. So if any of you are familiar with Revolutionary War history, you may recognize the name William Byrd III. He actually committed suicide in 1777, and Mary Byrd was left to manage this large plantation. So Elizabeth and her sister were close, so they were making their trip down to visit her, but then they ended up stopping at Mount Vernon for 4 days. And Samuel, on the trip down, kept a really amazing travel journal that is very cool to kind of trace how a couple would have traveled through Maryland and Delaware and through Virginia. They stay at Gadsby's Tavern, which is pretty cool. But then they arrive at Mount Vernon, and Samuel goes into great detail about seeing the house itself. And it's actually one of the best documentations we have of the house. It's in 1787, so the new room is being completed. The Vaughan mantle has been installed. So Samuel even comments on that on the mantle in the new room. And he says that he thought that it would be prettier without the columns. So I think that's kind of funny. But then the other thing that he says is when they're standing out on the piazza, he says that it's probably the most charming seat he's ever seen in America. So that's a very cool quote that we often use. And I think very fitting for Samuel, who's traveled so much, to be so intrigued by the house itself. But this image actually is one of our very special things that we have in our collection. This is what we call the Powell coach. There's a whole story behind this, so I won't go into great detail, but it's one of the only surviving coaches from this period. It's in wonderful shape, And it's just a really neat image. And they didn't own this coach yet when they came to Mount Vernon, but I thought it was kind of cool that to imagine it pulling up to the mansion and them coming out and seeing the house for the first time. So with that, after they left and went on to Westover, they came back through once more. And then, of course, Washington had his 2 years before he was elected president of the United States. And then when the temporary seat of the government was moved to Philadelphia, the Powels and the Washingtons became, they got to be in the same place again. So in that time, the Powels and the Washingtons again hung out, and they did things like go to the circus, and they also went to plays. So they were very much kind of a respite for entertainment for the Washingtons, but they also discussed politics, of course. Samuel was Speaker of the State Senate at that point, so Washington and him were very much interacting, but Elizabeth was very much a political advisor to him as well. And I do want to start talking about a very important letter that we have in our collection. And I know the image is a little small. You can see this on our website. If you go to our digital collections, it's scanned, all 8 pages of it. So as people know, Washington was kind of hesitant to run a second term. He'd been in politics for 40 years at that point, 40 plus years at that point. He very much wanted to go back to Mount Vernon and retire under his own vine and his own fig tree. And so he spoke with Elizabeth about that and his cabinet that he wanted to step down. However, he had multiple conversations with Elizabeth about it. And this letter, she actually wrote this in response to their final conversation, which was the night before the month-long election process began. So this letter is incredibly powerful. It's 8 pages long. It's full of reasons why Washington should continue on and serve a second term. She's upset that he would still have this desire to step down, even though it was the night before the election was beginning. It would be detrimental to society. And it's a great letter. And I actually have found some very neat things in my research that I'm gonna debut today on this video. So 2 things that I found is that this letter has edits from her husband, Samuel. And that's unique to this letter, at least from what I've found within her many, many letters that are located here at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, all over. So that to me shows how important Elizabeth's opinion was to George, that even though Samuel read over the letter, they still decided to keep it in her hand because her hand and her ideas would carry the most weight as far as convincing him to run. And then the other thing I found is that she used a political treatise and borrowed some quotes from this book, and she crafted her own arguments within that book. So, or with those sentiments from the book, and she used that for her letter. So she was very much taking inspiration from this book. And actually, Abigail Adams did something very similar with the Remember the Ladies letter from 1776. So this letter is awesome. And while we have it in our collection, it was not written at Mount Vernon. It was very much written at the Powel House. So Kayla, I'll stop talking and I'll let you talk more about how you interpret Elizabeth and use this letter.
Yeah, so this letter is very important to the narrative of our story as well. So I think that, and Sam did a great job of recapping it, but it's really this amazing example of, the only example of a woman making these comments to the President of the United States, and the only example of a, not cabinet member. So it's kind of incredible that, Elizabeth Powell was entrusted with this information, this confidential information. And we, it also, the way she crafts this letter is extremely eloquent. It's a well thought out argument. And it's really indicative of her intellect and obviously the mutual respect that Washington had for her. And she even kind of points out, and Sam, you can probably quote this better than I can, but she kind of points out, like, is it kind of not a selfish decision to go back to Mount Vernon? I mean,
exactly.
she said it's for the fate of saving the country, you know, the new country. It may not survive without you. And this is really, it's just interesting. She wasn't a woman who, she didn't have formal education, of course. This is the 18th century, but she was extremely well read. She didn't travel, as the Marquis de Châteauneuf points out in his journal. But she was, you know, extremely intellectual because she immersed herself in civic education, and she periodicals and newspapers and novels and books. And it's really, I feel like, this is the epicenter of like all of her intellect is really seen in this letter, which it's really well done. Obviously, you know, we can't say that she's the only reason that Washington made this decision, but I certainly think that it influenced him without a doubt. And the other thing that's great, I don't think you mentioned it, Sam, but again, I can't quote the manuscripts quite like you can.
Okay.
But Washington writes, you know, of course, he is elected unanimously. He accepts the position, even though he maybe did not want to, and then writes later in a letter to a colleague that, you know, his confidential friends well know that this, and you can finish it if you'd like, but that this decision was not taken lightly. Like, it was a difficult decision to make. And in saying that, he's more or less saying that Elizabeth was one of these confidential friends, and this is an example of proof, which I think is quite amazing for an 18th century woman. I mean, we don't think that she would have had the same kind of status, intellectual status, as, you know, you would have expected him to have with a male. And so this, I think, is a really amazing example of how she was able to use her political influence and what was afforded to her as a woman as a way to influence, you know, the new nation.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. You explained that very well. And yeah, the quote is it was only after a long and painful conflict in my own breast, I think is the dramatic quote for him.
That's something they had in common a little bit there, a little bit of dramatic
yeah.
But yeah, it's an extremely important letter, you know, to us too. I mean, we don't obviously have the originals at the Library of Congress, and Mount Vernon has the copy, which I think arguably is even cooler.
I agree.
Edits with Samuel, and I think that's also a really awesome commentary on Samuel and Elizabeth's relationship, because this means that, you know, they clearly valued each other's opinion. Like Sam said, for whatever reason, they felt that this would be more effective if it was in her hand and not Samuel's. And it was clear then, you know, the Marquis de Châteauneuf, like he said so many good things about them, but he also commented on how equal their relationship was. And I think that this, you know, is a good example of that as well, that they were very respectful of one another. They had a loving relationship, but like as two friends equally matched in, you know, taste, intellect, and, you know, I can't remember the last adjective there, but but it's true, and this letter is like a really great example of that as well. So.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That was a wonderful explanation for all of that. And I guess did you want me to go ahead and explain kind of what happened next after this letter and after Washington? Yeah.
It was written in 1792, correct? Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So shortly thereafter, they, you know, we're looking at 1793. So that's the wave of the yellow fever epidemic came through Philadelphia. And obviously it devastated Philadelphia. George and Martha Washington, they fled back to Mount Vernon. And the Powels, and they pleaded with the Powels to come join them at Mount Vernon, which I think you told me is, there's no other account of them asking anyone else to join them. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
So if you want to elaborate a little bit more on what
Sure.
that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. So as Kayla said, the yellow fever kind of exploded in Philadelphia, not dissimilar to what we are dealing with today. But the Powels, of course, they were affected, as many families were. Samuel Powell, actually, he died of the yellow fever, and the Washingtons did invite the Powels with them to flee back to Mount Vernon. There is a very sad letter from Elizabeth to George and Martha that it's sad when you think ahead about what happens 2 weeks later. It's her turning down their invitation to come to Mount Vernon. She says that Samuel thought that it would be better to stay, although for her own happiness, he wanted her to make her own decision, and for his happiness, he wanted her to make her own decision, because if she died, he would be very sad. Then she says the same thing, that she feels like if she wasn't there with Samuel, it would break her heart. And then sadly, 2 weeks later, Samuel passes away. She wasn't with him. She actually went to her brother's house in Western, just outside of Philadelphia. And so it's very heartbreaking. There's not a letter from the Washingtons to Elizabeth. There's no condolence letter. However, I'm sure that they visited her when they went back to Philadelphia nearly immediately. And Washington was alerted to Samuel's death by his comptroller of the Treasury on the 1st of October. And when the comptroller wrote, he said he mentioned Mr. Powell's death with the most sincere regret. So clearly that was more than he would say for other people too, as he listed out the deaths. So clearly that shows how connected the Washingtons were with the Powells, and how sad that must have been for George Washington too, to lose another good friend of his. So they really had just a special relationship. And so yeah, throughout, after Samuel dies, of course, Elizabeth goes into mourning. However, as Kayla mentioned, she is incredibly, politically connected. She doesn't just stop living when Samuel dies. And that is partially because she does have the Washingtons still in Philadelphia, and she very much keeps up her friendship with them. They continue to get together for tea and dinners. But then, of course, when Washington decides to step down and not serve a third term, Elizabeth loses one of her best friends, and he goes back to Mount Vernon. And before he leaves, they have an auction where they sell off excess furniture and sundries that the Adams administration didn't want. So Elizabeth went to that auction and found a piece of furniture that she very much wanted for herself. It is the presidential desk. So that is a picture of the desk. And this was the desk that Washington used for 8 years, which Elizabeth actually writes in a letter to him that even though there's some scratches on it, Washington wanted to sell it to her for a discount. She says she couldn't imagine anything more valuable than using the desk that was the repository for basically creating the government that held all these documents. And so I think it's actually very cool about the desk that Washington had it, but Elizabeth used it to write all these letters, to really live her life as a widow and run this business and all of these things. She had this desk for the rest of her life. But the reason why I want to talk about it isn't necessarily just because she used it as a powerful woman. She used her power in a different way when she acquired the desk. So as many of you know, if you are George and Martha Washington fans, you know that Martha Washington burned what she thought was all of the correspondence between her and George. And there's 2 surviving letters. But Elizabeth happened to find a bundle of letters in this desk. So she finds this bundle of letters that is from Martha to George, and it's all wrapped up in Washington's handwriting. And she writes to Washington, and this is very much their funniest exchange. She says that she's found a bundle of love letters from a woman written in the most solemn sanction. And she teases him and says that she doesn't open them, but she wants him to know that she has them. And then she very quickly goes, "I'm just kidding. They're from Martha Washington." And so it's a very cute little exchange. And that's the same letter where she was very poignant about using the desk. But then Washington writes back. So after he got to Mount Vernon is when he got the letter from her. So he ends up writing her back, and he actually also writes to her. He said, as he promised, he writes her a detailed description of his trip back to Mount Vernon. So she very much wanted to know how he was doing, how the roads were, et cetera, et cetera. But at the beginning of the letter, he very much acknowledges her funny little quip about finding a bundle of love letters. And he says something about how, oh, that would make him nervous if he had any love letters at all. And he says that the letters were filled with sentiments of friendship rather than of enamored love. And the warmth that she was inferring, the letters would only be of that warmth if they were committed to the flames. So while I don't think that's him saying he and Martha didn't have a, of course, loving relationship, I do think it's sweet, actually, that it gives another glimpse into Martha and George's marriage, but also into Elizabeth and George's friendship. And they do continue to correspond up until the last year of George's life. He goes back to Philadelphia once more, and they have tea together, they have dinner together. She helps him get a couple of gifts for Martha and then for his newest great-granddaughter. And then they unfortunately don't get to see each other again after the end of 1798, and George Washington passes away. And then a chapter of her life closes, but she led quite a life with Washington as a friend. So I do have a final little anecdote. And Kayla, did you want to add anything to that? Or
Well, I was just going to comment that, I think it's kind of endearing that she's almost teasing him about these love letters. I just think it's really interesting. So while she can write this very serious 8-page letter about how, the fate of the new nation relies on his decision, she can also, on the other side of the coin, say, just poke at him a little bit and tease him. And I think it's really, what kind of relationship that they had. It's not just a political or advantageous relationship. Clearly, they were very, very, intimate and friendly with one another. So I think it was sweet. So thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. I love the little turn that she can take with him, and yeah. So
but the thing is, like you said too, she didn't just stop her life. So after
no, exactly. Yeah.
Unfortunately, they weren't actually blessed with any children. They had 4 that died very early on, either in infancy or I think the oldest one made it to 2 years. So they didn't have any. They didn't have any children, didn't have any heirs, but that didn't stop her from having a lasting impact in Philadelphia. And so she really adopts the later generation. And I think it's really fascinating that she becomes so close to some of Washington's relatives. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about that too.
Absolutely. So this picture of Washington and this little excerpt of a letter does kind of give a good way to talk about. She did have a very close relationship with not only George and Martha Washington, but Bushrod Washington, who some of you may recognize that name. Great name. It is the George Washington's nephew who became an Associate Supreme Court Justice. And he actually was the first owner of Mount Vernon after Martha Washington died. But Elizabeth knew him first when he was a little young upstart 21-year-old law student. And the Washingtons introduced him to the Powels. And I think in a similar way that the Washingtons were very much led into elite society, they definitely introduced Bushrod into the elite society of Philadelphia. And Elizabeth, as Kayla said, did not have children of her own. So she very much took a liking to Bushrod. And then, of course, nieces and nephews. And I'll talk a little bit about one of her nephews. And they became very good friends. I didn't have a chance to put up one of Kayla and my favorite anecdotes where Bushrod writes letters back to his mother, several letters describing how much he loves Elizabeth and how his friendship increases for her every day, and he doesn't know when it will end. But the sweet thing is that she very much teases him a lot. And her way of teaching him is through teasing him. And one thing she does is he comes with a watch chain that he's wearing and he's very proud of it. But then she promptly tells him that it's not good enough. And then he comes back the next day and she has a new watch chain for him. And it's just very cute. And then there's a portrait that Bushrod had done in Philadelphia in 1783 by Henry Benbridge. And actually the Powels helped him pick out that portrait. And there's another little anecdote where Bushrod says that Benbridge would be lucky to paint him. And he says that he doesn't mean that he would be lucky to paint him as a person, but he said that to Elizabeth and she very much latched on to that and tells him that he thinks himself a perfect Adonis, but Bushrod says he blushed and the reproof and then they had a good laugh about it. And it's very a sweet little anecdote. And then the other person she was very close with was Nellie Custis, who throughout Nellie's life writes about Elizabeth, writes back to Philadelphia to her best friend, Elizabeth Bordley Gibson, always asks about Elizabeth, tells Elizabeth Bordley Gibson to update Elizabeth Powell on Nellie's life. One letter she says, tell my dear friend Mrs. Powell that her little Nellie has become a grandmother. So Elizabeth was very much connected with these descendants long after George Washington had died. So the last thing I want to talk about before we take some questions, I'm so excited to hear that we have questions, is this portrait and this little excerpt. So this portrait is done by an artist named Joseph Wright, who actually painted the portrait that I talked about earlier of Elizabeth Powell. This was done in about 1784, I believe. And the Powells actually owned a copy of this portrait. And this image is the exact portrait that the Powells owned. It was formerly at the Philadelphia History Museum, now with Drexel University. But the Powells acquired it sometime in the 1780s. And it's a wonderful portrait of Washington. This is actually one of the best portraits, but Elizabeth Powell's nephew did not think so. So this is a very cool little glimpse into Elizabeth's friendship with Bushrod Washington, but actually her very close connection and relationship with her nephew, who we are so grateful to her nephew's descendants because they've been connected with Mount Vernon for many, many years. And I meant to mention that earlier. So they're oh, yeah, go ahead.
Landmarks.
And landmarks, correct. So they're however many great grandfathers, John Hare Powell. This is written by John Hare Powell's son, Samuel Powell, this little note. And it's written in 1876. And Samuel Powell Jr., who was Elizabeth's great nephew, was born in 1818. So she very much knew him. And he was her little, she calls him her little pet in multiple letters, which I think is very sweet. But this describes the 19th century. So sometime after 1818, Bushrod Washington, when he was riding the circuit, when he was a Supreme Court justice, probably much prior to this, was eating dinner with Elizabeth Powell every Sunday that he was in Philadelphia. So this describes dinners that Bushrod would attend with Elizabeth, and then John Hare Powell, her nephew, who Elizabeth formally adopted, would come too. And little Samuel Powell would also be there. And at this point, Elizabeth was not living in the house that Kayla's currently in. However, she was living in her own mansion that she had built, but she clearly had this portrait hanging in a very prominent place because when John Hare Powell would be there, he delighted to tease Elizabeth that the portrait of Washington, that it was not an admirable likeness. And she would get very flustered and upset. And she would always appeal to Bushrod Washington, who would gratify her and say that it was a very accurate likeness and that it was a wonderful portrait. So I think it's a very cute glimpse into her and John Hare Powell's life and relationship, but then also her and Bushrod, that Bushrod would honor her and her opinion so many years later. And just kind of as a final thing, I think it's amazing that she hung a portrait of George Washington Washington in her house, because that hung in her house for the rest of her life. She carried on his legacy. She carried on the legacy of all of the other founders. And it's just a really cool way to think of this woman being her own independent woman, but yeah, carrying forth these stories. So she lived to be 87. So she lived a very long and very rich life. So that's all I have, and I'm really excited to take questions. And Kayla, do you have anything else you want to add before we take questions?
That was wonderful. Thank you, Sam.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so Cynthia Miller, I recognize this name, one of our greatest fans. So Cynthia Miller says, I am interested in the balls held at the Powel House. Could you possibly discuss a bit more about those? What was served, what people wore, who attended, what was discussed, etc. And I do want to say that the 5-plume hat, that's one of my favorites about the
yeah. Go ahead. Tell them about that, and then I can chime in.
And then you talk about, yep. One thing that I have found in my research that that people wore at the Powell House, there's a young woman named Anne Shippen Livingston, who was a relative of Elizabeth. She was a young woman, same age as Bushrod, attended some balls at the Powels during the 1780s, early 1780s, talks a lot about Bushrod actually, but she describes one ball in detail, her getting ready for the ball, and it took all day. And she showed up wearing a 5-plumed hat, so 5 giant feathers in the French style. So I love to imagine that outfit at the Powell House and what kind of performance she was putting on and how she was portraying this genteel woman, and as a young woman too. So that's my little bit about what people were wearing. So
to speak a little bit about like what was being served. So Elizabeth was well known for her dinners, and they were typically 3-course dinners, and they were very, very decadent. I guess the most famous example of this is John Adams's diary, where he writes about a most sinful feast again at the Powels, all of the things that could delight the eye, and he goes on to describe a lot of different sweets and syllabubs and all kinds of alcohol, and it's a very decadent affair. I think the best part about that quote, though, to be honest, is when they drink all of the Madeira and the port, and then they head to Christ Church steeple and climb it. It gives you kind of an idea of like what sort of parties would happen. It was a lot of fun. John Adams also wrote about like giving a toast to Elizabeth here, and it was very embarrassing, evidently, but we don't know what he said, but Samuel took it very well.
yeah, whatever it was, Samuel took it well.
It's funny because he comments, oh, she never did like me very much. So it's kind of funny, but another really important letter that we know of was from Sarah Franklin Bache, the daughter of Benjamin Franklin, to her father. On her father's birthday, evidently, she danced with the general on his 20th wedding anniversary at the Powels. So I would imagine that would have been in the very room that I'm sitting in right now. So it was what was discussed. It could have been anything from just entertainment of the day. It absolutely was some political affairs, since, they were often coming over after they had these deliberations. But it was really the epicenter of like social life, and the Powels were right in the center of it. So this was the place to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Susan McGill says, how do we know that Samuel edited Elizabeth's letter to GW urging him to run for another term? So the reason why we know that is that this is just kind of basic. In all of my research, I have learned the Powell's handwriting very well. And I was actually, it's kind of a funny thing, I was actually going to put a screen cap of the letter on our Instagram, and we have it scanned, and I accidentally zoomed in too close on the letter when I was trying to take a screenshot. And all of a sudden, I had looked at that letter so many times, all of a sudden I saw on the inside page, there was a letter, a word written above one that was an edit. And I realized that's not Elizabeth's handwriting, that's Samuel's handwriting. So I noticed throughout the rest of the letter, there's multiple edits in his hand. So that's how we know. Yeah. So it's funny what you can discover after doing so much research. Things always pop up for me, and that's what's very fun. I've so enjoyed the very multiple layers to the Powell story and all of their documents and all that. So that's what we do.
We're very fortunate that Elizabeth liked to write.
Yes, indeed, and that she liked to make copies of her letters. I don't know how she did all that, especially with all the financial records she left behind too. So she was a busy woman with that desk. Tammy, hi Tammy. Does Samuel Powell's descriptions sound great? Did he also describe the other Washington family members who are present during their visit? Yes, he does. And I meant to bring that up earlier. Bushrod Washington comes to Mount Vernon to dine with them with his wife at that point. He briefly mentions that the grandchildren are there. And then actually they go to the ruins of Belvoir Plantation. Washington brings them to see the ruins. And if you're a Virginian, you might recognize the name Belvoir. Belvoir is now Fort Belvoir. And that's where some of George's best friends in his early life lived, George William and Sally Fairfax. So Samuel brings up the visiting the ruins. He doesn't talk about the fact that it's George William and Sally's house, but I think that's kind of a cool thing for Washington to do. It's very personal. It's a glimpse into his life. And then actually the other relatives that he brings up are not at Mount Vernon, but when they are going down to Westover, they stop in Fredericksburg and they have dinner with Mary Ball Washington and Betty Washington Lewis. So I believe that's probably some of the only friends of the Washingtons that ever met Mary Ball Washington. So I think that's really cool. When I was looking through that travel journal, we have an excerpt of it at Mount Vernon, but I found the full travel journal and I saw that and I was like, wow, yet another connection that they have. So yes, he does describe friends and family. Tammy again. Did Elizabeth ever write to Fanny Bassett and Major George Augustine Washington? No, she doesn't write to them directly. She talks about George Augustine Washington actually when they are at Mount Vernon. Samuel does, but then Elizabeth writes to Martha after they've come back from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia, and she asks how Fanny is doing. And then I believe she says something briefly about George Augustine Washington. He passed away when Elizabeth was having her 50th birthday party. So the Powels could not, or the Washingtons could not attend that birthday. So yeah, so she did know who they were. All right, Cynthia Miller again. All right. Could you also talk about the Rittenhouse clock in the house and its significance to the house, as well as how that clock came to reside in the house? Thank you. Kayla, I will let you answer one.
I wouldn't even be able to answer all of that. So we have two Rittenhouse clocks actually. So we have a David Rittenhouse clock, which is owned by the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and we have a Benjamin Rittenhouse clock. So I'm not sure which one we're referring to, but the David Rittenhouse clock is actually downstairs in Samuel's office, or what we're portraying as Samuel's office. It's interesting because if you're looking at Georgia and Philadelphia at the time, the men are all very influenced by the Enlightenment period, and they are interested in ways to control their environment. So the clock, it has, that one has a metal face. So you might be talking about the Benjamin one, which also has an astrological face, or astronomical face, and it's actually just behind me in the hallway. But it is believed to be the first one that Benjamin Rittenhouse did of that kind. I'm not sure if that's what the question was, but the David Rittenhouse clock, we don't know the maker of that case, and I don't believe we know the maker of this one either, but we do own the Benjamin Rittenhouse one. I'm not sure how it came to reside here. That's a great question. I'll have to look into that.
Susan, hello. Where
here?
Yeah. Where is the Washington desk now? It is
So
it was also with the Philadelphia History Museum, and I believe it's now with the collection currently stewarded by Drexel. I don't want to get this wrong, so I'm not going to go into detail about it, but I know it is safe and sound.
Yeah, that's accurate. So it's with Drexel's, it will be with Drexel's collection. But I believe, I mean, I'm sure it's in storage at the
it is.
somewhere else.
Yeah.
We'd love it to come back home.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Susan McGill, what happened to the love letters that Elizabeth found in the desk? So in that letter, she does say to Washington that she will give them to Tobias Lear. But at first, Tobias Lear doesn't want them. He is too nervous that it's personal correspondence between Martha and George, which I think is very interesting because Tobias Lear was his longtime secretary. So you would think that there would have been some overlap, but maybe not. Maybe he really did respect George and Martha's privacy. But she does eventually give the bundle to Tobias, and I believe he brings them back to Washington. But what's interesting and kind of cool and just a glimpse into how people wrote letters and how they packaged up letters. Elizabeth specifically notes that she has bundled them up with her own paper and then 3 seals of her blessed friend's arms that she herself uses. So she makes sure Washington knows that she's seen the bundle, but she hasn't looked in the bundle. So sadly, I think that they were probably burned as well. Although I do really love the parallel of the fact that the 2 letters that survived that we know of were found in a desk. And then these were found in a desk. So clearly they weren't very good at taking their letters out of desks. So all right. So with this, I'm very happy that you were all able to join us today. And Kayla, did you have any final things you wanted to say before?
This was great. Just wanted to thank again Mount Vernon and thank you, Sam, for all of it.
Thank you.
And collaborate. And we're looking forward to seeing more of what your research, teaches us. So this is great.
Yeah, and I also want to say thank you to the Powell descendants who are watching. We're very grateful for you and all the stewardship and your love of your family's history. It's made my life so fun. And so that's all for me. And if anyone has more questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can find my email on our website, and I'm sure Kayla would love to answer more questions too. And definitely go visit Powel House. It is a beautiful house. I have so loved every time I get to visit. I always get to see something new. And Kayla has so much knowledge, and I know that the docents have so much knowledge. So please do go visit them.
Yes.
So with that, with that, I guess I will go ahead and say goodbye. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope to talk about Elizabeth again soon.